I want to say to those who have come to this lecture tonight specifically for the topic which was announced that I am sorry, I shall have to continue. That was supposed to be the passions of man, that I'm sorry, I have to continue discussing the process of repression of the unconscious and so on, and that will probably take this whole lecture. I shall then, the next three lectures, deal with the topics which are left in the program, and but I think I shall have to use this lecture today to continue with the problem of the unconscious. Now, I had last time tried to explain that we cannot talk about the unconscious or the consciousness as a thing or as a place, but we can talk about it only as an experience, as a quality of human experience. Either I'm aware or I'm not aware of something which is in me or outside. And then I had begun to talk about what you might call the conditions for consciousness. Or you might say, to discuss the question, how is awareness possible? How is awareness possible? Under which conditions can something which is real, which is in me or outside, under which conditions can it come into my awareness? And I was talking about the fact that it comes into my awareness primarily by filtered through certain categories, which in themselves are products of the culture or society in which we live. In fact, you might say there's a certain parallel here in the field of psychology with Kant's transcendental problem of reason and of the categories which are part of reason, like substance, time, and so on, causality. Actually, we can become aware only of something that is if our culture, our society, more properly speaking, provides us with categories which permit the experience to enter into our awareness. And I called this system of categories the social filter, and spoke about the first social filter, that of language. That it is very difficult to be aware of an experience for which there is no word in our language. I should just like to add to what I said last time about this, that there is one great branch of cultural activity which widens our awareness in spite of the poverty of our language, and that is art. Art, whether it is poetry, drama, painting, sculpture, has a function of making us more sensitive to a human or natural reality which we are not aware of were it not for the artist. Art has the function of widening the awareness of man. Art has a function of touching reality beyond that which the average person in the culture touches it. That's why it was said of the Greek tragedy that it has a cathartic function, a cleansing function, that we experience something in the Greek drama which we would not experience were it not for the talent, or more than the talent often, the capacity of the artist to touch reality transcending the language of every day, either by the dramatic or poetic form, or even by finding new words, or in sculpture and painting by a medium which does not require language at all. So you might say art has always had a revolutionary awakening function. It has always helped man to be in touch with reality more than it would be otherwise. And that is indeed the great difference between art and propaganda. And that is indeed the great weakness of so-called socialist realism in the Soviet Union, and the great weakness of capitalist realism in cheap art in our culture, that precisely while it tries to popularize certain ideas, it does not increase and deepen the sensitivity of man. I might express it in this way by saying that Homer, in describing the Trojan War, has done more for peace than many writers who have written about peace, but who have not touched as deeply the realities of human existence. I am the last one to deny the significance of writers who write for peace, and certainly this moment in history is not the moment to criticize anybody who writes for peace. But nevertheless, it has to be said that even writing about war, and thereby to intensify the reality of human experience, has a function which is in the long run as important or perhaps more important for peace than anything which is mere propaganda. You might say, historically speaking, the artists have always been the court jesters of society. They were permitted to express truth because they expressed them in a medium which appeared harmless and which pleased also those to whom this truth could have been dangerous, and because it was not the medium of the average man. And yet these court jesters have indeed been very necessary for the continuous process of widening and deepening man's experience. Now, the second aspect of the social filter I've been talking about is logic. It is a very peculiar thing that in every society people think that the rules which are commonly accepted in their society are just logical, and any rules of thought which are not commonly accepted are illogical. Now, we have in the West for quite some time now accepted Aristotle's logic as logical. And if something does not fit Aristotle's logic, it is just not possible. It's nonsense. For instance, A and not A cannot be an attribute of the same thing at the same time. That's why an experience which follows non-Aristotelian logic, or what you might call dialectical or paradoxical logic, is very difficult for one to be aware of. Let me give you a very simple example. You have invited a friend for dinner, and you feel in the evening very tired and wish you could go to bed. And then you get a phone call from his wife that your friend is sick and he cannot come. What do you feel? Well, that depends on what sickness he has and how tired you are. If you are just moderately tired and you get the message that he has a cold, I think you mainly feel glad. If you would have a message that he has pneumonia, I hope you would feel mainly not glad. But nevertheless, there are many transitions, and you might discover that while you feel, even if he has pneumonia, essentially sad, you might discover one feeling in which you also feel, thank God I can go to bed. Now, let me give you another example. Young man's father dies. The young man is 21 years of age. The father has been slightly tyrannical, perhaps, but not at all a bad man. And the son was very fond of him. So the son is sad, no doubt. But at the same time, he has a feeling of triumph. He is free. He is a successor. He's not any more subject to the father's commands. Now, what the son feels is a peculiar mixture of sadness and triumph. Now, have we a word for that particular mixture, which is sadness and triumph? Or have we a word for the first mixture of satisfaction and regret? No, we have no words for it. But also it's very difficult to be aware of this feeling, this contradictory feeling, because it seems illogical. Because we say either I'm sad or I'm not sad. Either I regret that my friend couldn't come, or I don't regret it. Now, Freud has used the word ambivalence, a double value, contradictory values, contradictory feelings with regard to one person. But you see, it is very difficult for most people to be aware of their ambivalence. Freud used the word at first to indicate that one loves and hates one person at the same time. Well, that's possible too. But what happens to most people is they either love or they hate. Usually first they love and then they hate. And they are not aware that at the very beginning there might already be an admixture of love in their hate, of hate in their love, and that at the end there may be an admixture of love in their hate. Our logic says, make up your mind. You either love or you hate, or you are glad or you are sad. And since our logic says this, the opposite feeling cannot come into our awareness usually because it seems illogical. And what is illogical? How can we consciously experience what is illogical? A third part of the filter are certain value judgments which are also built in the society for reasons of the structure of the society, which we are ever take for authentic, original value judgments of our own. They are moral value judgments. Well, I only have to remind you that Aristotle defended slavery with reasons which he thought were valid, when it's obvious for any 10-year-old boy that he defended them only because his society needed slaves in order to exist the way it did. Hitler defended destructiveness, ruthlessness against other people, and yet many millions of Germans accepted these value judgments as true, not because they were particularly evil people necessarily, but because generally accepted value judgment assumes the role of something which is naturally good or bad. You find the same thing, of course, in the aesthetic value judgment. If you see the aesthetic ideals, let us say, what seems to be an attractive woman in the 19th century, in the 20th century, or in the middle of Africa, or in Manhattan, well, obviously, the value judgments of what is beautiful are completely different. Not only different, they are completely contradictory. And yet these value judgments are so strong that a man will fall in love, be sexually attracted, and produce children because the woman has that particular shape, figure, face, and so on, which according to the value judgment of that particular society is desirable, while according to the value judgment of a different society would be most undesirable. His whole body reacts according to value judgments which are clearly results of the social structure and the historical development which has led to certain value judgments. Another layer of the filter is what you might call that which is not permissible, and hence unthinkable. Let me give you a simple example. A father has a 15-year-old daughter, and he feels a sexual attraction to her. In fact, he would like to sleep with her. All right, now, if he's a member of the middle class or the upper class in America or in Europe, this thought will hardly be conscious to him. He may find himself being told that when he goes to a psychoanalyst, but otherwise he simply will not think such a thing. If, however, he is a poor laborer or a peasant in a small town, It will be very often quite conscious to him, and it will not only be conscious to him, he will act upon it. On the other hand, if he has similar feelings, sexual desires with regard to young girls, and he's a rich man, well, he knows where to find them, except they are not his daughters. The wish is essentially the same. It's a sexual desire for a very young girl, and it depends entirely on the class, on the social class, whether that desire is permitted or not permitted to come to his consciousness. It is a well-known fact that incest is and by that I don't mean any analytic interpretation, but just as a simple fact, is a widespread phenomenon in social classes and exceedingly rare and practically not conscious to members of other social classes. I give this example to show that certain ideas are not permissible, not only in a society as a whole, but even different in their permissibility from one social class to the other within the same society. And yet these not permissible thoughts remain unconscious, generally speaking. If you analyze dreams, you find them often in the dreams. But it is the peculiar quality of dreams that the dream indeed bypasses what Freud called the censor, and what I would call here, it bypasses the social filter, because in the dream we are all free men. And we don't, since we are, as I tried to say last time, since we are relieved from the function of doing something about our survival, we are also relieved from paying so much attention what society thinks. You might say the sleep is so far the only true state of freedom men ever had. And the hope of many men is that we might have the same freedom when we are awake, but that apparently will still take a long time. Now, I think at this point I should interrupt myself and say that there might be seats available. I cannot see enough to be sure for those who are standing, but we'll stop for a few minutes to try that out. Yeah. One last layer of the social filter is one which I should like to call the impossible as against the possible. I shall explain what I mean by that by mentioning an example. For instance, for the European Middle Ages, or for European cultures until the 17th century, it was impossible really to think of a world without the concept of God. Spinoza had to make the most fantastic, and it seems to us peculiar, twists of thought, so that even long time after he died there was an argument whether he was or was not an atheist. In order to express as I see it, an essentially atheistic philosophy in theistic terms. Now, it was simply not possible to construct a philosophy which would not have in it the concept of God. It's quite possible today. But what is not possible today is, for instance, to have a picture of a world without war, or a picture of a world without national sovereignty. Of course, as a thought, people can have this, but it is a thought without reality to them. It is just a construction. It is not a thought which is really possible to think as something which could be real, at least not for most people. In other words, it is not only that which is not permissible, but also that which, under certain social circumstances, doesn't seem possible, which arrives at awareness only under great difficulties, or if one is aware of it, it's really a purely intellectual awareness, a pure construction, and not a thought which is taken or felt to be real. So, what is the result of the social filter? It is that our awareness of reality inside and outside is restricted, but also furthered by the society in which we live. To what extent the social filter and culture in general furthers or restricts our awareness of reality depends to a large extent on the nature of the society. I think it would be perhaps better then, instead of talking all the time about freedom and not freedom, to make a concrete distinction to what extent a society furthers or restricts awareness of reality in a person. I am not saying that freedom has not a part of it. Wherever you have restriction of freedom, you have very definitely the danger of narrowing down awareness of reality. But you might also say, where you have no restrictions of freedom, but a great deal of nonsense on television and in movies, you have also a great restriction in awareness of reality, because your mind is filled with fiction and unreality. So this question, to what extent a culture promotes, makes man more sensitive, or permits him to be more sensitive of internal or external reality, is perhaps a crucial question in deciding the value of a culture, of a society, from the standpoint of human development. And here, of course, one thing must be said. First of all, we must not confuse awareness with thinking. I should like to express that from two aspects. One is, let us assume you try to be aware of your breathing. You shut your eyes, you breathe, and you try to be aware that you are breathing, something which we usually are not aware of, although our life depends on it. Now, if you try to be aware of your breathing, you don't think about your breathing. You don't think about it, but you are aware of it. The thinking is something different from the awareness. The same thing holds true, let us say, you are aware of another person. You just see, you are aware of him. You are aware, perhaps you are very much aware of him. Maybe you love him, maybe you like him, maybe he interests you. You are very much aware of this person. But that only means you see intensely. It doesn't mean at all you think about him. You may think about him before. You may think about him later. Your thinking might even help your awareness. But being aware of him, just seeing his face, his movements, his gestures, seeing the fullness of this particular individual life as it manifests itself in that person, that is not primarily a process of thinking. So we must not confuse awareness of reality with thinking about reality. Secondly, we must not forget that indeed very often a person who confines, in whom awareness is very much confined to that social filter, to what the social filter permits, therefore is narrowed down in the expressions of life. Let me give you a simple example. And this is a clinical case which you find many parallels for. I'm thinking of a man who suffered from schizophrenia. And while he was schizophrenic, he was given clay to model something he liked, wanted to model, and he modeled animals, tigers, lions. After he had modeled them, he threw them on the ground and destroyed them. But what he did were pieces of great art, according to the judgment of artists who saw it. He was fortunate enough to become well, perfectly normal. Then the doctors asked him, well, don't you remember you made such beautiful animals? He said, no, I don't. Well, here is clay. Would you try? And he tried, and he did make the most conventional cliché with no artistic value whatsoever, and was not capable of creating that which he was capable of when the weight of the narrowness of thought imprisoned. Well, that's a wrong picture. The weight couldn't imprison him, but narrowed him down when he was chained by what you might call the social filter. In other words, there is a great deal of creativity which is simply inhibited and paralyzed by common sense, by reason, by all that which makes, first of all, a man feel, I am not creative because I am sheep, and I can only be a respectable person if I repeat what the majority say, or in fact not what the majority say, but what the leaders say. And that doesn't depend so much on the various political system. It's always the same story, really. Children are not yet so uncreative. In our dreams, we see that we are authors of the most interesting plays, stories, plots. And indeed, while we are awake, we wouldn't be capable even of, if we tried very hard to invent such a clever, artistic, interesting plot as we do all in our dreams. In other words, the Romantics, when they said that the intellect is an enemy of creative processes, were not so wrong. Indeed, it is in many instances, because here we find basically the contradiction between social requirements produced by the needs of survival of a given society with human possibilities. And so far in human history, there was never a harmony between the many human possibilities and needs and the requirements of society. And man has always lost in this battle. However, what he has gained was he could survive. Biologically speaking, that's perfectly sensible and perfectly logical. But psychologically speaking, man has paid a heavy price for the police, which protected him and his society. And I mean that symbolically now. I don't mean that literally now, although it could mean it literally too. But I mean it essentially symbolically. A great deal of human creativity gets obviously lost under the pressure of common sense, because nobody dares to be himself. Nobody dares to be an individual. Nobody dares to be authentic. And nobody dares to be free. And what is greater freedom than to create, than to feel, believe something for which I am alone responsible, or for which I'm responsible myself? Now then, we have to ask, I come back to this question, which I raised last time, what is the energy behind the social filter? I said last time it is, first of all, the subjective factor of man's fear to be isolated, man's fear to be an outcast, man's fear to be Cain, who killed his brother Abel and who had no home in the world. Man is willing to pay almost any price in order to avoid being completely alone. And secondly, it is a matter not only of his subjective fear to be ostracized or alone, but it is a matter of his survival. Since man has to live in a society, by and large, for the majority of people, adjustment to the rules of society is the best form of survival. Moral heroes and saints have indeed chosen other ways, but a hero and a saint is not guided by the biological principle of survival. He is guided by values which go beyond physical survival. The average man is not a hero, not a saint, so he does what seems safest for his survival, and that is adjustment to his society, and that means acceptance of the social filter which his society offers him. Now I have spoken all this time about the conscious and unconscious as social unconscious and social consciousness, and you might rightly ask now, what do I do with those repressions and with that part of unconsciousness which is individual? Well, I shall say a few words about this. First, an example. You will find many people who have a father who is weak and cowardly. It's very human to be weak and cowardly, and no reason for contempt. It's one of the most human things. Especially if you have a wife who is strong and destructive. And that is human too, because that's the way the Lord has made her, or the way she has become under her circumstances. So there's no reason for any indignation about all this. But nevertheless, it is very difficult for a little boy to recognize, to be aware, that his father, who is a blustering man, maybe quite narcissistic, who always says how right he is and shows a little boy that he owes him everything, that this father is really weak, as one would say in New York, schlemiel. That behind all this blustering and all this dominance and all this tyranny and behind all this autocratic kind of a thing, there's a poor man who tries to hide the fact that he's frightened, who tries to impress his boy. And the boy finds it very difficult to see that. Now, that is an example of repression. He is not aware of this quality of weakness in his father. And if you ask him, then he says, my father is a terribly strong man. I'm frightened of him. If you see his dreams, you find he's not a bit frightened of his father, but he's terribly frightened of his mother. But this is, as they say, in his unconscious. That means to say simply, he does not dare to experience the weakness or cowardice of his father. Why? Because this is not permitted by what you might call the family filter. The family filter is the individual family continuation of the social filter. The social filter says, honor your father and your mother. Some people think it says, love your father and your mother, but the Bible never said that. And it would be a good thing if people at least believed that. But the Bible says, indeed, honor your father and your mother. Not only the Bible, a great deal of social order rests on this command. Well, if you are to honor your father and your mother, how can you think that your mother is a destructive woman and your father is a weak and cowardly man? In other words, the family filter only emphasizes and continues what the social filter says anyway. And then the combination of family filter as a continuation of the social filter works very well. And also, of course, you are afraid if you, little boy of 9, would really show that you know that your father is a coward, where would you be? You are lost, so your father won't like you anymore. Your mother doesn't like you anyway. So even if the little boy would sense, and he does sense it, usually, the cowardice and weakness of his father, he must build up a legend in which he agrees with his father that he's really a strong man, and he may never be aware that it was all a legend. And only one day, 30 years later, when the father can't stand it any longer and breaks down and will tell the boy what he has suffered and how afraid he was of his wife, then he's not a young boy anymore, then the man of 39 will know that he knew that all the time. It isn't really news to him. But it was not permissible. It didn't go through the family filter. Now, then, of course, there are other causes for repression which are neither to be explained by the social filter nor by the family filter, but really by a truly individual filter. And I think the most Most instances of this kind fall under one of the following categories. One, that there is a conflict between awareness and conscience, or as Freud put it, the superego. Now, the two things are not the same. By superego, Freud means the introjected morality, the commands and prohibitions of one's father. By conscience, I mean a human voice which calls one to oneself as a human being and is not necessarily connected at all with one's father's prohibitions or commands. But a person is prone not to be aware of that which is in conflict with his conscience or superego. Secondly, and this is much more frequent, although we would like to think otherwise, a person is usually not aware which is in conflict with his persona. At least that's the way it has sometimes been called in psychological literature. That is to say, with a picture he wants others to have of him. If I want to be looked upon as a kind man, as an honest man, as a gay man, as a courageous man, God knows what, then anything which is in conflict with this picture, with this image, which I want others to have of me, anything which conflicts with that is very much handicapped in arriving at awareness. And you might say there are two more filters of an entirely individual nature. One is pride. This is neither conscience nor superego, nor is it the persona. It is just pride. It is a peculiar thing which is different from conscience, which is in contrast to shame, namely that a person is a great pride, and therefore anything which goes against his pride is very difficult for him to be aware of. And eventually the very simple and very important thing, fear of punishment. But by that I don't mean the fear of ostracism, but simply the fear of punishment. If you are terribly frightened to do a certain thing because you will be punished, then you will soon not think it any either. Because once you begin to think it, it's too dangerous. Eventually, when you think it, you might do it, and then you are lost. So direct fear is certainly one individual filter which prevents things from coming to consciousness. Well, I have tried to describe the various layers of these social, family, and individual filters. This is, of course, somewhat oversimplified. These categories are not also discretely separate, but nevertheless, I think they are essential categories which explain the question, what makes it possible that something arrives at that we are aware of an experience, and what prevents something from arriving at our consciousness, at our awareness. Now I want to speak about the question, which is one of the most difficult and fascinating questions, and about which in the questions which are written to me, to which quite a few referred, and that is a question, how can the unconscious become conscious? This seems like a miracle. In fact, it seems like an impossibility. Years ago, when psychoanalysis had just started, you find a number of very serious psychiatrists and other writers say that Freud was wrong because it was simply illogical what he said. If something was unconscious, how could it become conscious? And that was all there is to it. And since that was not logically possible, it was not possible in fact. But the fact is, things which were unconscious or are unconscious can become conscious. Or the question can be phrased more simply, how does it happen that we see before we were blind, that we are awake when before we were half asleep? It is all the same. It's all the same question, which is, how do we become aware or conscious of the unconscious? Now, in the classical model of Freud, there is an answer which is relatively simple. Freud believed that there are certain traumatic events in our childhood which we repress, which are repelled from our awareness, or which never arrived at our awareness, and they remain alive, these experiences, although not as conscious memories, and that if we can recall the affect and the memory together, that then there is, in this process, this is a therapeutic experience which permits to overcome the pathogenic influence of these repressed experiences. Now, Freud never meant that what is necessary here is a reconstruction. That is to say, you find that sometimes in various schools of psychoanalysis that one spends years on reconstructing a childhood situation. Actually, if you have reconstructed for a long enough time, you begin to believe it, because nobody wants to spend that much time, energy, and money on something which isn't worth anything. So you have reconstructed what happened to you when you must have happened to you when you were 3 or 4, and then this becomes your whole faith that because of that you are now a frightened person. Now, Freud never meant this kind of historical reconstruction. Freud never meant that analysis was simply understanding the historical process. You will find even quite a few analysts today who think that analysis, the therapeutic value of analysis, is essentially to understand what happened and why it happened. Now, that doesn't make anyone well if he understands why it happened. And not according to Freud either. This has nothing to do with one's evaluation of Freud theories specifically. A historical construction is very interesting, mostly for the one who does a reconstruction, sometimes even for the object of the reconstruction, if he happens to be interested in such things, but it does not change anybody and does not cure anybody. What Freud meant was that the affect is really relived, that what was once experienced is re-experienced again, and only that means that it becomes conscious. Now, logically, his means for that were free association, because he believed that the memory trace to that that memory traces will lead to the repressed experience, which is not only, as I already tried to say, a repressed drive or instinct, but the instinct plus its representation, plus the thought which expresses it. So Freud thought that by free association, you would be led to those links which link our consciousness with experiences which are repressed. And once you have made this connection, the experience itself would become an experience which I have become aware of. Now, indeed, that does happen. And many people who have been analyzed and some who have not been analyzed have nevertheless experienced that they became aware of a feeling they had when they were 4, 5, or 6. Actually, if you are interested, try. Sit down. Don't think of what you want to do tomorrow, but just try to concentrate and to feel how you felt when you were a boy or girl of 4 or 5 or 6, how the world looked to you, what you felt, how you looked at your father, at your mother, at other children. Well, and very often something will come up which makes this very fresh. Of course, we know by the experiments of age regression that and I think I mentioned that before, that all that we experienced is still in us, because in the hypnotic trance it can be produced. You regress a person of 30 to the age of 1, and he will sit there like a baby with his thumb in his mouth, because he really at this moment feels not as if he were 1, but that he is 1. That baby of 1 is in all of us, but it appears only in this drastic form in the stage of the hypnotic trance. But you can get it also without hypnotic trance, just trying to feel something. But again, here the social filter intervenes. Because if you are 30 or 40, respectable man now, you don't like to feel that there is a great deal of the little boy still in you. And therefore, you are a little cautious of going too far. Because how are you to confront your employees tomorrow, your secretary, when this morning you were aware that you feel like a little boy of 5? They might not take you so seriously, which from a human standpoint would be fine because it would fit the facts and would be real. But from the standpoint of your functioning as a boss, it wouldn't be so good because everybody would be confused. Your employees have to believe that you're a great and firm man and that maybe they have something of the little child in them because they haven't gotten any further in the society. But if you are up here, then, and the further up you are, the more you must stick to the legend that there's nothing childlike or childish in you, and therefore it is difficult to be aware of yourself as a child. Children didn't have that burden yet, but I say they didn't because it seems that in recent years mothers are very concerned that already little things of 5, 6, and 7 have a sense of status and of accomplishment of some kind or another. So well, there's a lot to be said about that, but there's no time. Now, what are other factors which help in becoming conscious of the unconscious? One is that, as it can be seen from what I said, a critical and rebellious attitude toward one's family and toward society is one very important condition for making the unconscious conscious. Naturally, if what I said so far is true, namely that it is a social filter with all the authority of society and of our parents and of our family, which make us unaware of certain experiences, then it must be of great help to open one's eyes, to do away with that particular mystique of the authorities of society and family, and to look things in the face and then to be critical. There's nothing better than for making the unconscious conscious than sound, independent criticism. I think that the teach-ins of the students these days, which are going on all over the country, might help many boys and girls better to become aware of their unconscious than maybe psychoanalysis does. Because for the first time, they see that there are others who dare to think. And that was indeed the motto of the Enlightenment, as you know, that one must dare to think. And it isn't simply an obvious thing to think. If by thinking we mean revealing something rather than repeating something. It is very important that for the possibility of becoming conscious of the unconscious, not only that one is critical, but also that one has what you might call a humanist sense that, after all, we are more human than anything else. Or, if you please, you might express it this way, an attitude to let oneself be. To let oneself be, without indignation or without great pride. So that's me. God knows why. I came into this world without asking, and I'll leave this world without asking. I'm thrown into it, as Heidegger would say, without my will, volition, without my plans. I have a short career here. I'm largely determined by circumstances, but let myself be. Permit me to be myself, to feel this, that, and the other. You can call it good, you can call it bad, but there is no need to repress it, because there is nothing with human which is alien to me. There is nothing human which I would have to deny. And I think anyone who believes that even the worst crime is not something of which he could also have a part, that such a one deprives himself of part of his humanity, just the same as he would deprive himself of his humanity if he couldn't think he might also be a saint. He might also be a saint. In us is all the possibility of being a saint and being a criminal. Usually we are neither, but both is human. And we have, most of us, with the exception of extreme forms of human existence, we have the possibility. And there is no reason to deny to our awareness the one or the other. And if we can permit ourselves to let ourselves be, namely simply human, then indeed we have made a great step in the process of becoming aware of that which we are not aware because it is not permissible, it is not possible, it is not given in our particular culture. Now, I would say, just as repression is due to affective reasons, de-repression is due to affective reasons too. That's why very often an analyst is necessary, or a friend, or a book, or some other person, not to feel utterly alone in the process of daring to become aware of what one is not supposed to be aware. I think that a great deal of what is described in mythology as the hero is a person who dares to be aware where the others don't dare, who dares to defy the conventions and who dares to go out into the world and to see something, what nobody else sees. The biblical figure of Abraham was a hero because he goes into a country which he did not know. And Prometheus was a hero because he dared to take the fire from the gods and to bring it to man. And he was proud to have done it even though he was badly punished. What I mean to say is, to dare to become aware of one's unconscious requires courage, it requires good company, and it requires a sense of humanity. All this should be represented by in a good psychoanalyst. But as I said, I think there are many occasions in life, including some very good books, which might be more helpful than some therapists are, by which I don't mean that the therapists are not helpful, but sometimes they just aren't. Because if the therapist is afraid of what people might think, how could he help his patients not to be afraid? And now, it also should be the function of the therapist to be stimulating in the process of uncovering the unconscious, or making aware things which one was not aware of, by simply presenting them to the patient. Usually that's called interpretation. Well, that's all right. I don't like the word particularly because you don't interpret, really, when you say, look here. And that is really what the therapist should do. The patient tells him something, and the therapist says, well, you mean to tell me this, but what I hear or see is this. Well, that can be very helpful. Now, a word about the act of becoming conscious. Many people think that they have to think and study and construct things, and then eventually, as a reward, they will become conscious of something which they have not been conscious of. I think that is a great error to expect that. Actually, what happens most of the time is that if one becomes conscious of something that one has not been aware of, it's a sudden process. It is like waking up. It's like opening one's eyes, and one has a feeling that one has always known it, and one cannot understand why one didn't know it. It isn't the result of theoretical considerations. It is something where the veil disappears. I rather should not say the veil, because we have thousands of veils. One of the many veils is removed, and we see more clearly. And that is the process of the affective side of that peculiar process, that something which we didn't know becomes accessible to our consciousness. Well, there are many examples for that. And if you're interested, I'm sure you find them best yourselves. It's no need for me to talk about them, because there are so many things. If we even begin to be concrete, rather than indulge in theoretical speculations of, we're using all these big words and so on, if we even begin to ask ourselves simply, well, so what do I know about this person? What am I aware of? What am I aware of in myself? What I'm aware of, for instance, of my own narcissism, of my concern with myself rather than my interest in the world? What am I aware of my own hostility, or maybe even my nicer traits? Well, if you try to differentiate between the picture you have and what you can really feel as being real, you see a great deal of, you might discover things which you were not aware of. You might, for instance, become aware of that you feel quite helpless and quite hopeless, while consciously you are very optimistic and everything is fine. One of the most dangerous states to be in. You make kind of futile motions. You will do this, that, and the other. You make plans. And you might suddenly become aware of that you don't mean any of these things, that nothing is serious about your plans. You find sometimes, I just think of a letter I got from somebody who writes she wants to build a house and somewhere, and it would be so nice to live there because we could visit there. Now it happens to be in Europe. For all practical purposes, we never visit there, and it's perfectly unrealistic to build a house with this idea we'll visit there. It doesn't make any sense. And yet that's the way many people make plans. They have their private fantasy of building a house. They will never build it either. But the house must have a reason, so you invent a reason, and you are not aware that you're absolutely hopeless, that you make all these plans because you want to overcome your hopelessness. And then you speculate and you have something to do. Well, other people do it with crossword puzzles or with sexual affairs or whatnot. It is all an attempt to overcome a sense of hopelessness which must not be conscious. Well, I want to say one more thing in order to conclude this chapter on consciousness and unconsciousness. What is the effect of something unconscious becoming conscious, or rather of our increased awareness? Now, the peculiar thing is that the effect, if we become aware of something we are not aware of, is always an exhilarating and energizing effect, even if the contents is not particularly pleasant. Why? For a simple reason. Because, as far as I can see, first of all, for biological reasons, any increased contact with reality makes us stronger. And inasmuch as we become aware of something which is, and that is our whole premise, which is, and which we have not been aware of, our contact with reality is increased. Therefore, there is increased energy whenever there is increased awareness. Because increased awareness means always increased contact with reality. Or if you want to use a symbol from Greek legend, It means to touch the earth with my feet rather than to be suspended in the air. You find, for instance, quite a few people having the following dream, that there's an aeroplane and they are flying in the air above the aeroplane. Now, that sounds perhaps quite nice, but it's a terrible dream, because it means they have lost any sense of reality. They are not even in the plane. Well, I'm not thinking now of these Russians who jump out of the plane up there. I'm too old to take that for real, deep down. But I'm speaking now about not that I doubt it, that it happened, but I'm speaking about that strange feeling that a person feels suspended in the air above an aeroplane, which usually means there's absolutely no sense of reality. Now, any increased sense of reality, even if the reality is bitter, increases our sense of strength and energy. It has some other effects. It tends to unify the personality and therefore to permit us the possibility of greater integration and greater unity. Actually, that has to do also with the problem of energy, because there is no doubt that the greater the conflicts are within ourselves, the more energy is wasted. If you want to be a criminal, be a good criminal and learn it, and be it with all your heart, because you will do it with great energy. And if you want to be a good person, then do it also with all your heart. But if you are split and run after two contradictory aims, what will happen is that you become either stupid or paralyzed, that a great deal of your energy disappears because it is eaten up in that useless friction between two contradictory things. There's nothing more weakening than contradictory aims in a person, or for that matter in a nation. And yet that is a usual thing. The world is full with good intentions and with evil deeds. And that is not even as Machiavellian as it sounds. The good intentions are in a way sincere, and the evil deeds are also sincere. And most people hope they can square the circle and that something will come of riding on two opposite tracks. Well, nothing comes of it, except that one's energy is weakened. I have again to remind you here of Kierkegaard's wonderful book, Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. The more we are aware of our inner reality and of the external reality, the more we are able to will one thing, because there are fewer white spaces within ourselves or in the world. It has also something to do with a sense of identity. The sense of identity is something which has been discussed in psychological literature and psychoanalytical literature in the last few years. I think is a terribly important thing. Namely, to be able to answer the question, who am I? Who am I? How can I say who I am when I'm split between contradictory motivations, part of which I'm not aware of? Who am I then? Freud wrote in one of his early writings, in the description of a case of an obsessional patient, he wrote something very interesting and very beautiful. This patient had what Freud was a very ambivalent in his love for a woman. And Freud wrote, if one is in doubt about one's love, one must have doubts about every lesser thing in the world. Well, I would add, if one is not only in doubt about one's love, but about one's conviction, about everything one stands for, about one's judgment in moral, aesthetic, and political and religious and philosophical matters, how can one not doubt oneself? How can one say I without having to use the crutch of saying I is as you desire me? I is as everybody else is. I is one, to use Heidegger's term. I is nobody, which is just the same. I is the faceless person who can put on one mask after the other because he is not aware of any reality within himself. Now, if by the process of making the unconscious conscious, that is to say, of increased awareness of inner and outer reality, if by this process there is greater unification, there is also greater sense of identity. And therefore, there is again increased strength. Well, I'm sorry, it is already 10:15, and I'll stop here. As you can see easily, the topic of what is the unconscious, what is consciousness, how does it become conscious, the unconscious conscious, what are the results, is really something which even in 3 lectures is impossible to exhaust. I hope to write about it at great length, but at least I tried to outline the main lines of thought of problems which I think are significant in this realm, because it is just too bad that people glibly talk about the unconscious and about repression and so on without being aware of the complexity and of the reality of these phenomena, just as one talks about this, that, and the other thing one has on one's mind and which has no particular importance. But nevertheless, this is the time to stop with this topic. Now, next, on Thursday, I shall talk about the passions of man, and in the Freudian concept, and as I see it from a concept of humanistic analysis, and I hope I can already begin also to speak about something closely related to it, namely the difference between sexuality and eros. Thank you. If we judge a culture by the amount of awareness of reality, how can we be sure that we are not still using a value judgment or a social filter? This seems like a lifelong process. Well, I think this question is similar to a number of other questions which raise the point of what is reality. And if one speaks, as I did, of awareness of reality, how does one find reality? How does one define reality? Well, this, of course, is a much discussed topic in philosophy. What is reality? And we could gain or lose a lot by spending our time in the discussion of what is reality. Is there something, let us say, real or outside when we see? Is there an object when we see, or is that all in us? Well, about the visual process is quite clear. There are wavelengths which hit our eye. Our brain transforms the wavelengths into, let us say, a color, and we project this color, red or brown, on the object. But this color, red or brown, comes into being only by the cooperation of something which is there, namely certain waves and the constitution of our brain, our optical nerve. So one cannot say what we see is real, but one cannot say either that it's not real. Now, the same thing holds true for what we consider reality in general. But it would be, I think, lead us to very abstract considerations. There are things which are simpler and more important. For instance, one can raise the question whether 15,000 men are necessary to save the lives of Americans in the Dominican Republic. Is that real or is that not real? Well, I don't think philosophical speculation will help very much in this decision. We can raise the question whether behind my very friendly and sometimes humble and meek appearance there is not a very narcissistic and even selfish reality which I don't permit anyone, including myself, to know about. If you ask how can I prove it, yes, you can prove it, because you can, and that is the same function as you have in science. You can by inference see that these and these and these data point out that what is shown at the surface is not real, that there's something real behind it. And again, you don't need any philosophical discussion to make the difference between fiction and reality. You may question what is reality on some higher level, but what is the difference between fiction and reality? That you don't need to question, provided you take things concretely. And very often the doubts about what is real serve only as a screen to hide from knowing that which is discernible and knowable as real. So let me say, let us try to apply what is real and what we are aware of with those things where we can know what is real. And let us not get too concerned about those things which we have difficulties in knowing. There's plenty of what we can know, enough to spend a whole lifetime on it. The next question says, you started by saying we should be more aware of our ambivalence and ended by stressing our unity of thought as way towards being. Isn't it better to doubt than not to? Well, I think it is better to doubt than not to, but then the doubt itself should arrive, one should not remain a continuous doubt, but eventually conflict should be resolved. I would say conflicts are better than no conflicts, because in the process of facing conflicts, what happens is what Nietzsche once called, what doesn't destroy me makes me stronger. There's no better place for growth, no better possibility for growth than facing conflicts. And one of our modern ideas that the best thing for a child is never to have any conflict is one of the poorest ideas imaginable. But at the same time, what matters is what happens to the conflict. Do I spend my life leaving the conflict unsolved? Then, if that is conscious, I am an obsessional or compulsive neurotic. The problem is precisely that the doubt and the conflict should arrive, but that it should be solved by increasing awareness of it. Because the strange thing is, once we see the conflict, once we are aware of it, we have a very deep-seated tendency of wanting to do something about it. And precisely as long as we don't see it, we are protected from acting. You said that conflict uses up energy. Would it be accurate, therefore, to assume that the myth implying that an artist is more productive as a consequence of his misery is false? Well, that touches upon a very difficult and complex problem. You hear sometimes that artists, the more they suffer, the more productive they are. And sometimes you can also see that artists have undoubtedly a considerable percentage of severely neurotic people in their ranks. In fact, more than among scientists. It seems to be a scientist, you need a greater amount of objectivity and realism than to be an artist. But at the same time, I think such general statements as that the artist is more productive by his when he is miserable. Certainly such statements cannot be made because they are contradicted by many facts. Goethe was a great artist, and certainly he wasn't miserable, except that he was a man who could say that he felt happy maybe 3 times in his life. That is to say, he had a deep sense for the essence of life, for the falseness of what many people would have called happiness. Because if you take the life of a man like Goethe, nobody could be happier than he. He was one of the most successful artists the world ever had. But still, he knew that living deeply and intensely meant suffering a great deal. Well, the whole psychological problem of the artist is so complex, although it's very interesting, that I don't really feel I can touch it in a few words. The true artist is terribly lonely because he has to see by himself, and he has to see deeply. And he also knows that the many people who say he's a great artist, that most of them don't know what they're talking about. So he's a very lonely man. And if you are lonely, you experience a great deal of suffering. It takes a tremendous courage to still go on saying or painting or sculpturing what you see when you know this is all done on your own responsibility. There are a few things which one has to do alone. One is being born, one is dying, and I think another thing is to create. Because by the very nature of creation, you have to be on your own. If you create what others tell you is nice, you might be successful, but you are not an artist. Here's a question. In the beginning of the primitive culture, many of the mores that extend into the present were evolved by the elders to rule the tribes. Why then are we so reluctant, in view of our better knowledge, to drop these mores and to replace them with our better psychological and psychological findings? Well, I think the elders still rule the tribes. Just the same, we don't call them elders. We have different names in different countries. And I think men are still sheep who are afraid of having an independent judgment, that is to say, most of them. So the mores cannot be so different. It is indeed one of the aims of democracy that we shouldn't have elders whose voice is listened to as if it were the word of God. But right now, our State Department says that these people who dare to make judgments about political questions in Vietnam and other places of the world are really gullible people who don't know what they're talking about. So I don't see quite the difference to the elders, although I'm very much in favor of not accepting this view as a binding one for people who have a chance to voice their views, provided they have the courage to think. Here's a question: is it too late to start therapy at age 21? Even though you have just discovered that the fact that your father is very neurotic does exist, and you have been under his influence all through your life very strong. And now, doubt your own thinking, you are very frightened about what was taught. Well, you see, I guess that the people who laughed here must be the older people. Because naturally, a person who is 21 believes she's already very old. But those of us who are 50 or 60 or 70 feel one is very young. And certainly it's not too late because of age. But it may be too late because of lack of interest in life, because of lack of courage, because of lack of vitality. All this idea that there is a certain age limit may be very good for a bureaucratic age limit to development and change, may be very good for bureaucratic purposes, but it's no good for judgment of when a person can change. A person can change if he has the vitality, the drive, the energy, the vision of wanting something. And he will not change when he is 20, provided all this is lacking, and all he's interested in is to crawl under and to be good and to do what everybody says is the most useful thing to do. We are just kidding ourselves if we think these things are matters of age. You indicate that the social filter alters reality, as though reality is something objective. Isn't reality entirely subjective and therefore determined by the social filter, social and other filters? Well, I really answered this question in my first remark. I didn't really answer it, but I tried to respond to it. Except I should like to say one thing here. Certain fictions have a self-predictive value, function. That is to say, if you feed yourself long enough with the idea that another nation wants to conquer, to attack you and to conquer you, then eventually you behave in a way in which somebody behaves who is to be attacked tomorrow. The other nation fears that too. And then indeed, after some time, both nations may arrive at the point of war because their own ideas have produced a reality. And then those who have always were in favor of strict and so-called realistic measures will say, you see, we were always right. What they don't admit is that it was precisely their thinking which led to the effects which allegedly they fear. If the reliance on an observance of the social filter is anti-creative, does it follow then that antisocial behavior is necessary for true creativity? That is Van Gogh's and Beethoven's antisocial behavior a natural consequence of their genius? If so, how with Bach? Well, that again is a question which I touched upon before, and I can again say certainly an antisocial attitude is not a condition of creativity. But one can also understand why the artist might have strong antisocial feelings because he's terribly lonely, because he protests in some way. Of course, there are some artists these days, in philosophy and in art, who have strong antisocial feelings and make a lot of money with it. That is always a little suspect, but that was not true of Beethoven and not of Van Gogh. Why is the great middle class always spoken of with such disdain? Even intellectuals can be middle class in this great society. Well, I confess to that as far as I'm concerned, but I didn't speak with disdain of the middle class. On the contrary, nobody speaks with disdain of the middle class because it's notorious that most Americans feel themselves belong to the middle class. That has been shown in all relevant sociological studies. Most Americans want to be middle class, behave middle class. Now, why? That is a complicated question. It is certainly one way of not being conspicuous and doing what everybody else does. You may think of a very simple thing. In America, all cigarettes cost more or less the same. In Europe, there are not only different cigars, which exist in America too, unfortunately, but also in cigarettes. That is to say, the cigarette is a symbol for that vast process of equalization which has happened in America, namely where everybody smokes the same cigarette. And that corresponds to the feeling we are all middle class. Well, that I think is part of a very healthy process of, you may call it democratization or anti-feudalization. But I don't think anybody speaks with disdain of the middle class, and I'm sorry if the person who asked me this question felt that I was speaking with disdain of the middle class. How could one? Is a humanist pacifist position that human life should not be risked in war? And if so, how is a nation to protect itself from another nation which may be under the leadership of a psychologically sick person, that is Germany under Hitler or Red China under their present leadership? Well, in the first place, the humanist pacifist position is that one shouldn't kill, not that one shouldn't risk one's life, unless the questioner meant risk other people's life. Or I thought from the way it's formulated, it meant risk one's own life. Now, the other question, what a nation does in front of a mad man who has taken the power, taken power in a state, that is indeed a question which is terribly difficult to solve. But at the moment, we are not confronted with that question, thank God. At the moment, I don't think there are madmen anywhere in the world in the seats of government, of any important government, including the leaders of China. I very thoroughly disagree with China's policies, with its foreign policy, with its inner policy. I feel very unsympathetic to it. But I think to assume that Luo Enshai and Mao Tse are madmen is really indulging in utterly unrealistic thinking. They are exceedingly intelligent, capable men who have shown that for many years, and that, I think, is one reason for the hope that it may be possible also to come to a peaceful solution with China, precisely because its leaders are not mad. But of course, that is in the realm of politics. But so I suggest not to tackle problems which are not realistic, but to tackle the problems which are realistic, namely that the leaders of the Soviet Union are not mad, our leaders are not mad, and yet we are confronted with a very serious possibility of nuclear war. That's not a problem of madness, that's a problem of all sorts of premises, which it would take too long to discuss now. But Hitler was a rather unique case in recent history as far as madmen goes. Now, about Stalin, one might say something similar, but that also leads too far. Stalin is dead, and thoroughly so. How do you explain the repression of an experience in a patient which is not in keeping with the social filter? Or do you not believe this is possible? In other words, I think the question means, how to explain it? If a patient, if a single individual represses something which he would not need to repress from the standpoint of the social filter. Well, I think I spoke about that the social filter is the most general filter. Then comes the family filter. And then come individual filters, which are, you might say, almost bordering individual idiosyncrasies or allergic reactions, which have nothing to do with the social filter, which can be quite against the social filter. I mean, quite out of keeping with it. There one has to study the individual reactions, the individual circumstances, but I don't think there's a general answer. Certainly that happens. It happens that people repress things which in the general culture from the standpoint of the social filter are not at all things which ought to be repressed. Here's a question. Do you think that LSD or expanded consciousness drugs are positive forces in releasing potential creativity? Well, I have no experience with it personally, so I cannot answer the question. The fact that I have no experience with it personally, however, expresses that I personally have a certain idiosyncrasy against all drugs which are supposed to widen our spiritual experience or human experience. But men like Aldous Huxley, who had a great deal of experience with it, were quite of the opposite opinion. So I can only express a very personal feeling of not being in sympathy with this as an attempt to widen awareness. But then I may be quite wrong about it. Here's a question. What part does responsibility play in daring to be? Well, what is responsibility? The word is interesting. Responsibility comes, the root of responsibility is respond. And so you might say a responsible person is a person who responds. that is to say, is a human being who, as a human being, responds to what is around him. That is responsibility. That is our responsibility, to respond. Now, most of us do not fulfill this responsibility. We harden our hearts, we shut our eyes, we do not respond because we stay within a small circle of personal interests and do not respond to others, do not respond to what goes on in the world. Well, I think to be responsible in this sense has indeed a great deal to do with daring to be, because this is precisely being in awareness if I dare to respond to what I see. But I cannot respond if I'm half asleep, if I'm half blind, because I don't see, and if I don't see, I cannot respond. Now, if one uses the word responsibility in the sense in which it's often used, as equivalent really with a moral aspect of duty, I'm an irresponsible person if, for instance, I criticize a government in its foreign policy because it might interfere with the intention of the government. Well, that, of course, is a very different concept of responsibility, of irresponsibility. To be responsible can only have meaning if I know who I am, if I know what my conviction is, and if I dare to stick to it. Otherwise, I'm just sheep. And if you call sheep responsible because they all march behind the leader, that is something else again. They may imagine to be very responsible because they keep in track, and when they eventually led to the slaughterhouse, they are most responsible because they don't make any trouble. But responsibility in a deeper human sense requires awareness of who I am and what I see. Otherwise, the word loses all meaning in a moral or humanist sense. Here's a question. If consciousness, awareness, to be a I'm sorry, I cannot read it, so I'm take another question. Where does the mental states, such as depression, anxiety, etc., fit in the filtering of the awareness? Well, I find it difficult to understand what is meant here by mental state. But perhaps I could answer the question in this way. If you mean by mental states here psychotic states, namely especially schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, or paranoia, or mixtures between them, then we have a very peculiar phenomenon, namely that the psychotic person is so narcissistic and so remote from reality that the social filter does not operate in him. And therefore, he is aware of what the normal person is not aware, not because he is an artist, because he's so creative, but because of his lack of relatedness to the outside world. The social filter has completely disappeared. In other words, paradoxically, in the psychotic person, there is really no repression, because that which is unconscious, which is fantasy, which otherwise wouldn't pass through the social filter, is quite open because the social filter doesn't operate. But it doesn't operate not because the person is so free and independent, but because the person is so completely out of touch with others, so that it cannot operate. Let me take one last question. Where do our emotions lie when we are not experiencing them? Well, it's a very legitimate question. Do they lie in what Freud conceptualized as a preconscious, or is the question more like the old question, where does a fire go when it goes out? Well, I can give a very clear answer that it is not what Freud calls a preconscious. Because what Freud means by the preconscious are such things which we just don't happen to be aware of at the moment, but which we could be aware of without difficulty when we want to. Therefore, the preconscious is not at all unconscious. It is not separated from our awareness by resistance. However, where the emotions lie when we are not aware of them, that indeed, to answer, is really the question for neurophysiology. If you ask a Japanese, he will point to this. He feels here. We say in our language, we talk about the heart. But obviously, there is something which is neither in the viscera nor in the heart, but in the brain, which is a receptor of that which we are aware of and yet not conscious of. That is to say, that is the question which I touched upon briefly. What is this thing, intuition? What is this thing of knowing something without knowing it? Where is this awareness? That is a question which is really impossible to answer. Not because it's mystifying, but because we don't know enough yet about all the neurophysiological processes which would localize it. Psychologically, there is not a question of a place. Neurophysiologically, yes. There is a question where in our brain you have the seat in which unconscious awarenesses are deposited. Well, there are many more interesting questions, and I appreciate that you write them, but unfortunately it's time to stop. Good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.